So, of course, we have Ryan Grimm. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
And we have Neha. Welcome, Neha. Thank you again, who is joining us from overseas, and it is very late at night for us. So we really do appreciate. I didn't think she was going to be able to make it on, but I'm really glad you could join us this evening as well, because this piece that you guys wrote was really a fantastic piece. So just so we have some context, let me read a little bit from this article. In the early years of the Silicon Valley disruption, two Harvard graduate students dreamed up a bold experiment in education. Shannon May, who studied educational development in rural China, and her husband, Jay Kemmelman, an education software developer, spied an untapped opportunity for the moving fast and breaking things going on all around them. And what, you may ask, was that opportunity? Well, it was selling education to Africa, and the result of this was the formation of this company called Bridge. So, Neha, could you give us a little bit of a context about how this came together, what this project was, and sort of how it developed so rapidly? Because within less than a year of landing in Africa, in Nairobi in Kenya, they're setting up schools. So what was the philosophy behind this? What was the disruption that these people were doing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, these two founders, Shannon and Jay, basically took a look at the education landscape, and they saw this huge opportunity to educate young African children from low-income neighborhoods. And I think that's really key when we look at the stories, that these are not only young African children, but they're particularly vulnerable because of the background that they come from. Most of these kids live in what is referred to as slums in Africa, but these are densely populated informal settlements. They tend to be higher crime rates, younger dropout rates, early pregnancy. This is the background that these kids are coming from. So, they looked at this and they were like, okay, there's a need for these kids to be educated. And they decided to create a chain of for-profit private schools that they would offer at a very, very, very low cost. And so when it comes to this, you think about, okay, if we're going to be charging kids the tiniest amount for education, but we need to keep the schools going, how exactly are we going to do that? Well, with volume. So they needed to expand. They needed to get as many kids on board as possible to make the kind of money they wanted to make, to give a return to their investors. And they were able to basically raise money from all of the biggest names in the game, right? You've got the Zuckerbergs, you have the Omidyars, and they also got funding from places like the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the lending branch of the World Bank. So really big, significant investors. And on the face of it, the education that these kids were getting had really good outcomes. And the way they did that is they took a curriculum that was developed in the halls of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where these guys had gone to graduate school. And it was a good curriculum, good lesson plans. Although if you talk to people in the countries that these kids are in, there's pretty diverse opinions on the education that's being offered. And we can come back to that. And they standardized that and they put it on a tablet. And so they handed these tablets out to teachers at the schools. And basically these teachers were meant to read word for word from these tablets. So it was this isn't the kind of learning that you'd see in a private school in, let's say, the United States, which is small classrooms, dynamic back and forth discussions, that kind of creative learning that gets kids to think independently. This is really rote memorization. And once they had that formatted, once they had this tablet learning, as we point out in the story, and Ryan and I looked at this pretty closely, that education really didn't need to be taught by teachers at all, right? Because if you're reading off a tablet, you don't need to be a teacher. You just need to be able to read. And so that was, did I just cut out, guys?
No, you're still there.
Great. I saw a little swirly thing. So that was, that's the basic premise, right? Is that you've got these kids that are being educated teachers reading off a tablet, classrooms that are getting bigger and bigger, more and more students getting enrolled, and that's when quality starts to slip.
So there was some kind of quality at the beginning of the project, but as it scaled up, it was not a scalable. It was not scalable, or at least it couldn't be profitable at scale. Ryan, do you want to take that?
I mean, if you think about what they can charge these children, we're talking about $5 to $8 a month. Then start, in order to make a profit, you have to then be running these classrooms, at less than $100 a month, all in, and that's the teacher pay, or the instructor, or whatever you want to call them, the reader. That's the corporate headquarters. That's the schoolhouse itself. So that was another place that they cut a lot of corners. Chicken. They call them chicken coops for kids in some of these areas. Just chicken wire, a little bit of concrete, mostly wood and kind of tin. And then that's it. So how do you turn a profit with that? And the only way to do it is absolutely massive scale. They're talking about 10 million, trying to get to 10 million kids, so that you're actually seeing numbers that are going to kind of justify the investments that these investors are looking for. Because while it was the Zuckerbergs, Gateses, Omidyars of the world, the kind of do-good financiers, the ones who go to Davos and talk about how they're going to do good and do well, it's their for-profit arms. It's not like it was the Chan Zuckerberg grant making operation, or the Gates Foundation. That's just, you can have lots of criticism of what they're doing, but they're giving that money away. They're trying to make money on these investments. And so if you're only charging a kid $5 a month, you got to put that education together for $3. And that's where the danger comes in.
What was fascinating to me that I want to talk about is that how they're so overt, particularly in their Harvard study, where they say that they want to have a McDonald's-like kind of academy in a box in terms of how they refer to these kinds of these institutions. And did any of you realize, or did you think about how there was so much symmetry behind the rush to neoliberalization through the charter school movement in the United States and what they're trying to export in terms of this African model, and how a lot of the usual suspects like Nicholas Kristof, a lot of these same type of individuals who support charterization are supporting this new exported version in Africa? Did you notice a similarity in the synergy behind those two types of developments?
For sure. I'll start, Neha, and then you can go. On at least a couple of points, you saw a ton of parallels, and one was the specific people, like you said, like Nick Kristof himself. Wrote an article celebrating this and saying, my liberal friends need to, not just dismiss this just because it's for profit. They need to understand that perhaps they have, these smart Silicon Valley people, maybe they have cracked this. So it was exactly the same people, but also the hostility to teachers unions was there, like that, central to the Bridge International Academy's model was making sure that there were no teachers unions, and their biggest enemy, kind of, and as they see it as their biggest enemy, is teachers unions in Africa, who from the very beginning were like, this is a complete mess. And you're right, they literally did call it an academy in a box. And the funny thing is, she even says out loud that they were originally going to call it a school in a box, but then they learned that in Kenya they called good schools academies. So they're like, oh well, we'll call it an academy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I think one of the other things that we see as a parallel, right, is this idea of giving up on the public school system. And in Kenya, for example, there are huge issues in public schooling. You've got statistics around teachers who don't even show up to class, right? And you've got all these kids who need an education. And the idea is kind of well, we're offering them something better than they would be getting in the first place. But then the question is, are you offering them something good, or are you just offering them something better than what they would get in the first place? And I think those are very, very different. And then when you look at the students, the demographics of the students who are being offered this education, the question arises, would we be having these conversations in a wealthy suburban neighborhood in Kenya, in Nairobi, for example? No, we wouldn't. And I think that's a really important thing to look at as well.
So there's, yeah, I mean, that's obviously a class dynamic in this.
Hmm.
This is well, because all over the world, the wealthy elements of the population in Africa, the Middle East, India, they get a good quality education, or they can access a good quality education. But this seems to have been like a very cowboy job. You have a quote here where May says, "We're technically breaking the law," right?
Yeah.
So it's like, well, no, you're not
You always
technically.
like when you can get a quote like that.
I
It
think
helps.
she probably regrets that one.
But can you talk about how these guys were relating to the governments in these, like what's the dynamic at play here? Teachers' unions in the US, we know, often have a conflictual relationship with the government. In fact, often they're some of the strongest unions existing in the United States. Are there parallels in, are there dynamics in, for example, Kenya, a desire for the Kenyan government to break a powerful union and use this as a vector? Or is the Kenyan government being sold this as like a solution to what they see as an intractable problem? Or is it a bit of column A, a bit of column B? Can you talk about a little bit, how did they get away with breaking the law?
And so
in this
Neha would know more about this, so I want her to basically take this. But I would just want to lay out one parallel, which is, to me, Uber is a perfect example. And Uber, rolled out this model in the U.S., but then also very heavily rolled out this model in Africa, which says we're just going to break the law and we're going to grow so big that you have no choice then but to negotiate the terms of your own kind of government surrender. And I think you saw a similar thing unfolding here. But now I would know a lot about kind of the intricacies of how they navigated Kenya, also the other Africa that they eventually expanded into.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably slightly different in every country, and there's been a different trajectory in every country. One of the places that Bridge has opened and operated is Libya, and they basically had a completely failing public school system, and that in that situation, the government wanted them to come in. They essentially wanted to outsource their schools, because what the Minister of Education at the time said was like, we are in a situation where it is just simply impossible for us to get our school system up to the way that we want to run it. And the issue is so bad that we don't see a point really in continuing to try to improve our public schools. So rather than doing that, they decided to outsource, and they outsourced to a couple of different of these for-profit private chains. That's an extreme example, right? Of a government.
I think you meant Liberia. Right?
Liberia. Sorry, excuse me. And that is an example, basically, of a government coming in and saying, we are almost done with our public school system, and you guys just take it over from here, kind of hands in the air. Kenya is a really different example, because they do have a functional school system. They are a functioning government, and they do have the resources and the ability to kind of scale up and improve their existing public school system. But, oftentimes something is sold, as you were saying, as a solution, as a good idea. And I think in this situation, there are probably advocates who just think that this is the right solution. If you end up with the right advocates within a government system, they have a lot of leeway. And there are teachers unions, there are individuals, there are civil society and non-governmental organizations that are speaking out. But if you've got the right people supporting you, especially in a country like Kenya, especially in a lot of these African countries with very strong centralized governments, you end up in a situation where the school is able to operate with certain level of impunity, and there's not going to be an issue there.